Welcome to the FarmBits podcast, a product of Nebraska Extension Digital Agriculture. I'm Jackson Stansel.
And I'm Samantha Teaton, and we come to you each week to discuss the trends, the realities, and the value of digital agriculture.
Through interviews and panels with experts, producers, and innovators from all sectors of digital technology, we hope that you step away from each episode with new practical knowledge of digital agriculture technology. Welcome back to the FarmBits podcast for the third episode in our Precision Crop Protection series.
When it comes to diseases, timeliness of preventative measures is critical to ensuring that as much crop yield potential as possible is maintained.
We heard from Trace Genomics in the first episode of this series about technology that leverages soil microbiological analysis to warn farmers of disease potential in their fields.
In this episode, we welcome Kristine White, CEO of Spornado, to learn more about how Spornado is using spores of fungal pathogens detected in fields to help farmers stay ahead of potential diseases.
Kristine was trained as an environmental engineer and translated work that she was previously doing with indoor airborne fungal analysis to the Spornado technology.
While the Spornado itself is not specifically digital, there is significant potential for further digitalization, and data collected via the Spornado may be effectively leveraged alongside other digital tools.
Let's learn more about Spornado through our interview here with Kristine.
My name is Kristine White, and I am the CEO of Spornado. My background is actually looking at air quality and fungi, but indoors. So I spent many years in environmental engineering, going through buildings, looking at air quality issues, doing a lot of sampling for fungi indoors. And then around, it was probably 10 years ago, I went over to the lab side of things, and I started working at the microbiology lab that analyzed my samples for many, many years. So yeah, that's kind of my background in terms of how I got involved with air sampling, with fungi. It was mostly actually in the indoor environment. So I've been operations manager at the microbiology lab for a number of years. And how Spornado started is we got a phone call one day, and it was kind of, those kind of friend of the friend type calls.
Sure.
They wanted to do some spore monitoring outdoors. And what they were looking for was an easy to use wind powered air sampler that farmers could put in their fields. And okay. I said, oh, okay. Yeah, you know what? No problem. I'm going to call up my suppliers. I'll find you something. No problem. So I started looking, and I was really surprised. There actually wasn't anything. The only then this was around 5 years ago, the only air samplers used outdoors in agriculture were, very large, expensive units that university researchers, government researchers mostly used, one, because of their complexity, and two, because of the price tag of, 20,000 and up.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I reported this back to the person that was looking for the air sampler. And at that point, I said, there really isn't anything. I said, however, would you like us to design one?
Sure.
The owner of the lab that, that I'm associated with, he's a professor at University of Toronto. So really easy for us to put together a team of people through the university that could design and test the sampler. And so they said, yeah, that would be great. And I should have mentioned, sorry, that this was a large crop protection company.
Okay.
That wanted to do this work. They wanted to do the spore monitoring in potatoes specifically. So okay. That's kind of how we started out. The agreement was we would design the sampler and keep the IP.
Awesome.
And so that first season, it was used in potato and late blight. And, we kind of thought, okay, that was great. That was a fun little project. And then surprisingly, we started getting phone calls the next year for the next season of different groups that were interested in using the sampler that had heard of it. So we saw, definitely there was a demand. that, growers wanted to know what was going on, in the air in their fields.
Right.
And we were quite surprised that this wasn't being done, So we spun Spornado out into a separate company, and that's how it all started. We got our start in potato, and now we're in a number of different crops.
And so how exactly does the Spornado work? I mean, it sounds like a really demanded device, but you said it's air powered and it collects spores in the field. I'm curious. I've seen pictures, but I'm sure our listeners would love to hear kind of a description of it.
Yeah, sure. It's a simple cone shape that has a wind vane on the back. So it's on a pivot. It's as easy to install as hammering a pole in the ground.
Nice.
It mounts on this pole and it pivots with the wind. So it's always facing into the wind. And inside that cone is a small, around 1.5 inch diameter plastic cassette. And that cassette holds a membrane that actually collects the spores from the air.
Gotcha. And so what are some of the challenges of capturing and measuring those spores within a crop field? I mean, how did you go about developing this? Was it very similar to kind of the indoor samplers that you'd worked with before, or were there a lot of new design challenges that came with being in an agricultural environment where you may have irrigation, or you may have very tall crops that maybe impede on wind flow, stuff like that?
So there was some unique challenges. So for indoors, it's generally good enough to know the genus of the mold, of the fungi.
Okay.
So you can identify it under the microscope to the genus level. Now, the thing with plant pathogens is that's not enough. You have to go beyond the genus to the species level. The key there is that can't usually be determined under a microscope. So the big thing is with the agricultural fungal pathogens, we need to test it by DNA analysis. So we can get that highly sensitive and specific identification of not just the genus, so not just like, for instance, Phytophthora. You want to know the species. Is it Phytophthora infestans? Because that's a specific one that will cause disease. So yeah, that was the big challenge. Is it does have to be DNA analysis.
And spatially, how many units would be required within a single field for the Spornado to measure and predict disease issues before they occur?
Yeah. So what we have found that one Spornado per field, up to around 100 acres is a good kind of coverage. Now, if you perhaps had a vineyard that, had maybe some very different localized conditions in certain areas, maybe a really wet area or another area that you had disease problems with historically, you might want to put another one in. If it's a very homogeneous, large, wheat fields, that could be extended a bit. But, roughly
Sure.
speaking, the guidelines are on one per farm up to 100 acres.
And so on that front, if it has to be DNA analysis, I mean, that obviously can't be done right now, or at least not inexpensively on the actual unit there in the field. And so how exactly do you go about getting these analyses executed? And is there a certain standard protocol that you run? I'd love to hear more about that side of Spornado.
Yeah, sure. So this cassette that I described, it's changed out of the sampler at regular intervals. And again, that's crop dependent. That cassette is then put into an envelope and couriered off to a partner lab overnight. These partner labs, they use standard protocols, and they participate in QA/QC programs with us to make sure that we have consistent testing across the board. And then within 24 hours, the agronomist or the grower, whoever sent in the cassette, they get the results sent back to them via email or text.
And so is that 24-hour? I mean, that sounds like a very convenient and pretty quick turnaround, especially for like DNA lab testing. Is that 24 hours typically enough for a farmer to get out ahead of these diseases? And what have you seen on your end, Kristine, as far as the time that a farmer has to really get on top of the diseases that are captured via the Spornado?
With fungal diseases, these products work best if they're used preventatively. So before the disease is set in. So early alert is so important. And what we're finding is we can, for instance, in potato for late blight, we're finding spores in the air 7 to 10 days before any impact on an untreated field.
Wow.
So that gives the grower, a good week to get out there and spray.
Sure. And so I guess on that front, I'm just, thinking about the cassette removal and sending, things into a lab analytically. I mean, is there any particular warning or I guess message that goes out to whoever is in charge of managing that particular Spornado unit to let them know that there may be fungi spores on the cassette that need to be sent in? Is this something that is kind of just a kind of like a regular maintenance action almost on the part of whoever has put that Spornado out there in the field? I mean, how exactly do people determine the frequency with which to go out and collect those cassettes? Or is there some warning system on the Spornado to help them with that?
No warning system. It's just done on a regular interval.
Okay.
For diseases, that are an issue most of the season, like some of the mildews, the blights, the monitoring happens every week, for up to 10 weeks, with a change of once or twice a week. Now, in something like canola, where the susceptibility is only in the flowering period, it's only a few weeks, but sometimes they do it, up to 3 times a week to really, be able to pinpoint when the disease is there.
So management decisions for plant pathogens, they often consider disease cycles and crop management systems together. How does the Spornado system tailored to managing these specific diseases that can vary a lot in their biology and ecology?
Yeah, absolutely. Basically what we're doing is we're just kind of filling out that last corner of that disease triangle. Traditionally, there's been, a lot of work on predictive models using weather. And then of course you have your host. We are kind of that third, we are telling when the pathogen is present. So it's just another tool in the toolbox of the agronomist or grower. They look at historical information of their own field, what the weather conditions are, and base their decisions on, the full picture.
And your DNA analysis that your partner labs are doing, is the goal of that to kind of tell the grower, tell me everything that's in my field, or is it tell me if this specific pathogen would be in my field?
Great question. Yeah, the testing that we do is pathogen specific. So we are looking for the, certain disease, so we're looking for Sclerotinia specifically. We have done some R&D where we've done whole genome sequences where that does tell you every single fungi that's in the air at that time. It's very interesting, but it's very difficult to interpret, to know really what does that mean.
Sure. Yeah. And is that something that a grower or grower consultant has to, I guess, pre-order at the beginning of the season, say these are the specific fungi that I'm looking for over the course of the year, or is that kind of just a package that you offer on your end to say these are the different, spores that we're going to be actually assessing for?
Yeah, so at the beginning of the season, the grower or the agronomist lets us know which they are looking for. And we have a number of them that are established and ready to go. And then also, we're always open. We're always adding new diseases to the list. So, that's an option as well.
So I guess thinking market wise now, you've mentioned both growers and agronomists slash crop consultants kind of being users of this particular device. And I'm not, necessarily asking for specific breakdowns on each, I guess each one of those groups in terms of who your major market is. But I am curious to know exactly who is kind of driving adoption a little bit more, whether it's consultants that are really looking to get an edge for their clients, or whether it's growers that are just really interested in kind of doing this and seeing this for themselves.
Yeah, it's been a combination. Often the initial push is from researchers, government, university, and grower groups.
Sure.
So that's often our like introduction to a new crop. And then once, it hits the point of being commercialized, it's probably, its majority would be agronomists. And then, but not far behind actual growers, large growers buying them and, managing them themselves as well.
And you mentioned that potatoes were kind of the first crop that the Spornado was developed for. What crops exactly has Spornado been demonstrated to work in, and were there any design specifications or limitations that each crop had that you've had to adjust the product for, or is it pretty much standard across a lot of these crops?
Yeah, so the nice thing is the equipment itself and the cassettes, they can be used so far with any crop, any disease. We do start when we branch into a new crop to do wind tunnel testing here in our lab. One of the challenges we always have is getting positive controls. That's one of the first things that we need to do to get the tests up and running. But besides that, we often use really well-researched, published primers and probes to do the tests. And so that allows us to expand very, very quickly. We are in, as you mentioned, grapes, canola in Western Canada, wheat, sugar beet, tomato, a number of horticultural crops, onions, cucurbits, blueberries. And then this year, we're pretty excited. We have, trials going on for the first time in, I think we're in 5 or 6 new crops.
Wow.
Including, corn, soy, apple, strawberries, and grass for seed.
I'm curious how exactly you design those field trials to be able to test whether it's actually, getting the right results and whether, the information is really being efficacious for the user.
Yeah, so we've done a number of different things. We've done some density trials where we've put them, a number of them out in one field to see if there's much of a difference. We've done some trials at different heights. To see is height going to make a big difference. So in grape, we put one, way down, maybe a foot or so off the ground, and then one just above canopy level.
Sure.
And so what we're finding, and it's not overly surprising, I guess, is just with air, there's so much mixing involved. Right. There's so much dilution that so far, we haven't seen a very large difference in terms of height. So right now, our recommendation is that the Spornados put in around a foot above final canopy. We haven't, and we didn't see much of a benefit of putting them at a closer density, than 100 acres. And then in terms of, efficacy of whether the tool is working, we have partners in the trial, do intense scouting throughout and report back when they see disease, and we compare that versus when we're detecting it in the air.
Got you. So in that way, I guess you're kind of able to hone in on what exactly that predictive window is and really kind of give the growers and consultants a good outlook for what the disease pressures might be here in a week to 10 days.
Exactly.
Got you. And so I guess on the efficacy side, what are some of the benefits that farmers and consultants are seeing, whether economically or just anecdotally from using the Spornado out there in their fields?
Yeah, so we'll start with the growers. Some of the benefits that they're, reporting back to us is, that they'll get a positive result. They will go out, scout. They won't see anything, but they'll put on, their specific fungicide. The next week, they do their sampling, or the week after, and those results are negative. So, it's giving them comfort that they are treating at the right time. In other instances, let's say in Eastern Canada, there hasn't been a lot of, for instance, late blight. The weather conditions haven't been conducive the last season or so. Also having that added data that there's no spores in the air, gives you a little more comfort to make the decision not to put on that fungicide, so they can spread out their sprays a bit.
Sure.
And then in terms of agronomists, what they're telling us they like is it saves time scouting. It doesn't replace it, but it definitely, provides more information and can help you to know where to target your scouting, or where you can, focus it. And then it's also, it's removing some of the guesswork,
Right.
You're still looking at weather, you're still looking at other pieces of the puzzle, but, it's removing some of the guesswork whether or not the disease is there, which is good for them, for their recommendations, and also good for the grower to be more comfortable with them.
Looking forward, do you see ways to leverage the data that's generated from the Spornado to predict disease trends, like regionally or even spatial trends that are year to year within the same field? If you do happen to have multiple different Spornado units in that field, I guess I'm kind of wondering if that initial crop protection company that reached out to you to start developing this tool, if they kind of had any vision for that to be kind of the future here.
Yeah, we think that the data could be really, really useful in plugging into a lot of the exciting predictive models that people are doing already, and the other technology, some of the imagery technology and such. We think that it can really kind of, flesh out this picture of what's going on in the air above growers' fields.
So does Spornado plan to eventually incorporate any onboard diagnostics, and what would be necessary to have that incorporated?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of things we've done is we have tested in-field diagnostics. So you can get portable DNA units that you can go into the field and do the testing. There's units that use, it's called RPA, almost like a pregnancy test, a bar showing
Sure.
Type of unit. We've tested both of them. They do work. It still is very cumbersome, widespread use. Are people going to be able to do this like on a tailgate of a truck? Maybe not. It's extremely precise. So in terms of onboard diagnostics, it's definitely in our R&D kind of wheelhouse. But for us, it probably will not be molecular based. We're looking at other kind of technologies. There are some in-field molecular tests, so real-time tests being developed, but again, extremely costly, extremely delicate machinery, and you still have to go and you still have to change out the consumables in the machine once a week.
Sure.
So it's still very, very hands-on.
Sure.
So we're looking at developing something that won't require, visits to the site every week. So what we're anticipating is that telematics will actually go a step further and tell the farmer what is in their field.
Awesome.
But that's still, several years away. And, one of the reasons why we did bring Spornado to market now is because It's super easy. It's really inexpensive. It's ready to go. And we really felt that, farmers didn't have another 5 to 7 years to wait for this information. They've waited a long time. They've waited long enough,
Absolutely.
And the nice thing is, when there's, higher tech that might be appropriate for grapes or for horticulture or anything in North America, this technology is really one that can be used internationally.
Yeah, that is a huge benefit. And I'm just thinking, you said one of these units costs, is just several $100s. And I'm thinking about the amount of money that farmers spend on fungicides or, may need to spend on fungicides in a given year per acre. And if only one of these units has to be out there per 100 acres, I mean, that seems like it could be a potentially massive return on investment.
Yeah, the ROI at this point really does make sense. If you're able to pinpoint your fungicide use, and then of course there's always saved yield, which is really the key, right?
Absolutely. Yep. We've kind of talked about where Spornado is going, and I'm not sure, is that what you're most excited about for the future of Spornado, or are there some other things that I guess we didn't ask about yet that you're super excited about in the future for Spornado?
Well, of course, we're always really excited to get into different crops and different regions and countries. And that is kind of very exciting for us that this can be used in all over the world. But I think right now, one of the things that we're most excited about is since we're using DNA analysis, at the same time as we're detecting the spores, we can test for fungicide resistance. So I'm super excited about that because not only will we be able to tell farmers when to spray, but we can help them tell them what to spray. So we're starting our first trial this summer with actually some partners with the Ontario government, looking at fungicide resistance. So we're testing the spores to see, for instance, are they resistant against FRAC7 group or 11, 13?
Wow, that's going to be a huge benefit, I think. So if any of our listeners want to learn more about Spornado, where would you direct them to kind of learn more about the technology, where they can get it? And actually, I'd never even asked you, is it available in the U.S. yet?
Yeah, we have tons of them in the U.S. Yep. And we've participated in a couple of excellent U.S. accelerators. So yeah, we are there. You can find out more about us at spornadosampler.com. And we try to keep our Twitter up to date and let everybody know what we're up to. And that's just at Spornado Sampler.
One thing that we always like to do is we like to end on kind of a piece of advice. So for anybody out there who's listening and wanting to get ahead of disease pressure in their crops or the crops of some of their clients, what is your piece of advice, I guess, as they're looking at new technologies to do that?
I guess, my advice would be just to use whatever predictive tools that are available to them in the crops that they're in. A lot of the U.S. universities have put out, a lot of weather modeling predictive tools. And so if that's what is available, use it.
Thank you very much to Kristine White for joining us today on the FarmBits podcast. It was great to hear from the CEO of kind of a young startup that is basically turned to technology that was originally built for indoor pathogens, or kind of her expertise in indoor fungal pathogens, into a technology that's very well suited for the agricultural industry. I think my favorite part of the podcast, I guess there were two parts of that episode that were pretty intriguing. Number one, being able to tell farmers pretty much what to spray by looking at the resistance within the actual genome of those fungal spores that are trapped inside the Spornado. And then also how they're looking at leveraging telematics to really improve upon their technology and make it a little bit more accessible for farmers to use.
Yeah, I also thought it's a really important technology for working with resistance monitoring, for scientists to use that as a tool. Also for early detection of the disease, very important. And I also liked how Kristine brought up their work moving into more of an international work. I think that is really cool for the future.
Absolutely. Yeah, they'll get to see a lot of different crops, and I'm sure run into some new challenges along the way. So we thank you very much for joining us today on the FarmBits podcast. Hope you'll join next week for another episode diving into precision crop protection.
Thank you for taking the time to join us today on the FarmBits podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts to be informed about the latest content each week.
We welcome your feedback, so if you have comments or questions for us, please reach out to us over email, on Twitter, or in the review section of your favorite podcast platform. Our contact information can be found in the show notes.
We'd like to thank Nebraska Extension for their support of this podcast and their commitment to providing high-quality informational material to members of the agricultural community in Nebraska and beyond.
The opinions expressed by the hosts and guests on this podcast are solely their own and do not reflect reviews of Nebraska Extension or the University of Nebraska-Lincoln.
We look forward to you joining us next week for another episode of FarmBits.